At 18 years old, Nell Bishop owned nothing but the clothes on her back and a debt she had never agreed to. Her uncle, Silas Pruitt, put her on the road out of Widow's Bend on a gray October morning, telling her she was no daughter of his and never had been, and that a girl who refused a decent marriage could find her own supper from then on. She carried $4 sewn into the hem of her only good skirt, a Bible with her mother's handwriting crowding the margins, and nothing else worth naming. 5 years later, she rode back into that same town with 2 of those $4 still folded soft in her coat pocket, and used them to buy 1,200 acres of ruined range that had once been the grandest cattle empire in the territory, the old Calloway Range. Sold off for unpaid taxes, cursed by nearly every mouth in Widow's Bend, nobody warned her what was sealed beneath the floorboards of that dying ranch house, waiting 5 long years for a bishop to come home and open it. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Nell Bishop. If you have ever been told you were worth nothing and believed it for a while before you stopped, tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Nell had been born in the spring of 1866 in a 2-room cabin at the edge of Widow's Bend, Dakota Territory, in the years when the grass still grew taller than a man's belt and the herds moved across it like weather. Her father, Thomas Bishop, was not a wealthy man when she was born, but he was a careful one, and in the frontier country of that decade, careful men sometimes became wealthy simply by outlasting the reckless ones. He had come west from Ohio with little but a good eye for cattle and a habit, learned from his own father, of writing everything down. Every calf born, every head sold, every debt owed and every debt paid went into a ledger bound in oiled leather that he kept on the shelf above the hearth. And he told his daughter more than once that a man's word was only as good as his memory, and memory failed, but ink did not. It was the first lesson Nell ever learned, long before she understood what it would someday cost her to know it, and long before she understood what it would someday save. Her mother, Ruth, was a quieter presence, a woman who had been raised on a Kentucky farm and brought west a hope chest full of linens and a gift for healing that the whole valley came to depend on before there was a doctor within 40 miles. Ruth Bishop delivered half the babies born in Widow's Bend in those years, set bones, brewed remedies from chokecherry bark and yarrow, and never once took a coin for it that the family did not desperately need. She used to tell Nell, while braiding her hair by lamplight, that a debt of kindness paid forward was worth more than a debt of money paid back, because kindness had a way of multiplying itself in places you would never live to see. Nell did not understand this either, not truly, not for years. But she kept the words the way she kept everything her mother said, folded away somewhere close to the center of her. Thomas Bishop's cattle operation grew slowly and honestly through the late 1860s, and in 1870 he took on a partner, a hard, ambitious man named Cyrus Calloway, who had arrived in the territory with capital from an uncle back east and very little patience for slow, honest growth. The partnership was drawn up by a circuit lawyer and witnessed by half the town. Bishop and Calloway. Equal shares, equal say. The range and the herd and the brand belonging to both men and, on paper, to their heirs after them. For 3 years it worked. Thomas brought the knowledge of cattle and the trust of the small ranchers who sold him their surplus stock at fair prices. Cyrus brought the money for expansion, the railroad contacts, the hunger. Together they built what the newspapers in Cheyenne began to call the Calloway Bishop Range. 12,000 acres running cattle by the thousands. The largest operation between the Black Hills and the river. Nell grew up inside that success without fully understanding its size. She remembered a childhood of good boots and a warm coat, of riding out with her father on spring roundups, sitting the saddle in front of him before she was big enough to have her own horse, of her mother's kitchen full of ranch hands eating supper at a long table that never seemed to run out of food. She remembered her father teaching her to read a brand at 50 yards and to add, columns of figures faster than the hired bookkeeper. Not because he expected his daughter to run cattle herself one day, but because he believed, in his quiet, unfashionable way, that a mind untrained was a mind wasted, whether it belonged to a son or a daughter. She remembered Cyrus Calloway, too, though less warmly, a tall man with cold, assessing eyes who came to supper sometimes and complimented her mother's cooking in a voice that never quite reached the compliment's meaning, and who looked at young Nell the way a man looks at an entry in a ledger he has not yet decided whether to keep. She was 10 years old in the autumn of 1876, when the whole of it came apart. There had been a bad winter the year before, heavy losses in the herd, and money grew tight even for an operation as large as Calloway Bishop. Thomas wanted to slow expansion and rebuild the herd carefully, the way he had built everything else. Cyrus wanted to borrow heavily against the range itself and push further west before competitors did. They argued through that whole cold season, and Nell remembered lying awake hearing her father's raised voice through the cabin wall for the first time in her life. A voice she had never known could go that sharp. And then, in November, 300 head of Calloway Bishop cattle turned up missing from the North Range, and a brand inspector from the territorial office found altered hides in a gully near the Bishop cabin, and a rope halter with Thomas's own initials burned into the leather tangled in the brush beside them. And within a week her father was arrested for rustling his own cattle, a charge so strange and so damning that even the men who had known Thomas Bishop for years found themselves uncertain what to believe. He never stood trial. He caught a fever in the territorial jail that winter, the kind that took hold of a man already broken by disgrace and did not let go. And he died in a cell in January of 1877, still insisting, to the one deputy who would listen, that he had never touched a head of that stock and did not know how the evidence had come to rest where it was found. Ruth Bishop followed him within the year, worn through by grief and the shame the town had heaped on the family. And Nell, not yet 12 years old, was left with nothing but the ledger her father had always kept, which someone had thoughtfully saved for her from the burned wreck of the family's belongings, and a debt of $200 that the bank said the estate owed against a mortgage nobody in the family had ever heard of. Cyrus Calloway, as surviving partner, absorbed the whole of the Calloway Bishop Range into his own name within the year, and the empire from then on carried only his. Nell was taken in by her mother's brother, Silas Pruitt, who ran a modest dry goods store in town and who accepted the girl the way a man accepts an unwanted parcel left on his step, dutifully and without warmth. For 8 years she lived above that store, sleeping in a storeroom among crates of nails and bolts of cloth, working the counter from dawn until the shop closed, and hearing, more times than she could count, some version of the sentence that her father had been a thief and she ought to be grateful anyone would keep her at all. She grew into a young woman, quiet and watchful, careful with her words the way her father had been careful with his figures, and she kept the old ledger hidden at the bottom of her trunk, reading it some nights by candle stub after the store had closed, tracing her father's handwriting with one finger as though the letters themselves might tell her, eventually, what had truly happened on that North Range in the winter of 1876. The fall, when it came quickly. In the spring of Nell's 18th year, Silas Pruitt informed her, without much ceremony, that he had arranged for her to marry a widower named Hollis Grigg, a man near 50 years old who held a note against Silas's store that Silas could not otherwise repay, and that the marriage would settle the debt and secure her future besides. Nell refused. She had known Hollis Grigg her whole life as a hard, close-fisted man who buried 2 wives already worn thin by him, and she told her uncle plainly that she would rather work as a laundress in Cheyenne than spend her days under that roof. Silas's temper, which had simmered under a thin lid for 8 years, came fully to the surface then. He told her she had her father's ungrateful pride and her father's talent for ruin, that he had fed and clothed her out of Christian duty and gotten nothing but defiance for his trouble, and that if she would not do as told under his roof, she could find another roof to be defiant under. He gave her until morning. She left before the sun was fully up, walking out past the dry goods store with a bundle over her shoulder and $4 sewn into her hem. Money she had saved penny by penny from the rare tips customers left at the counter over 8 years. Hidden from her uncle's eye because she had learned early that anything of value left in his sight eventually vanished into the store's accounts. She took her mother's Bible and her father's ledger and nothing else that mattered. She did not look back at the town as she walked north along the stage road, though she heard, behind her, the low murmur of a few early risers on the boardwalk who had seen a Bishop girl thrown into the road and found in it exactly the confirmation of ruin they had expected all along. The 5 years that followed were not easy, but they were, in their way, the years that built her. She found work first in a boarding house in a rail town 2 counties north, scrubbing floors and mending linens for a hard but fair woman named Ottilie Ferris, who fed her decently and paid her honestly and taught her, almost by accident, how a business ledger balanced when it was kept with care, and how quickly it fell to ruin when it was not. From there she moved further north still, to a cattle operation outside Miles City where a rancher's widow named Constance Reyes had inherited 3,000 head and no one willing to believe a woman could run them. And Nell, 19 years old and hungry to prove the particular thing her whole childhood had denied her, offered to keep the woman's books in exchange for a bunk and a wage. She stayed 4 years. She learned to read range grass the way her father had taught her before she had words enough to understand the lesson. Learned to spot a sick calf before its mother did. Learned the slow arithmetic of a herd's growth and the faster arithmetic of a herd's ruin, and she learned, watching Constance Reyes face down bankers and cattle buyers who assumed a widow could be cheated, exactly what a woman with nothing but her own steadiness could accomplish if she refused to be moved. It was in the spring of her 23rd year that word reached her, through a drover passing through Miles City, that Cyrus Calloway had died the winter before, that his only surviving son Wendell had run the great Calloway Range into debt within 3 years through drink and poor management and worse company, and that the county was preparing to auction the ranch itself for unpaid taxes, the whole 1,200 acres of what remained of it. The minimum bid set at $2 simply to clear it from the rolls. The drover told it as a piece of gossip, a joke about how far the mighty Calloways had fallen, and laughed when he said no one in 3 counties would touch that land even for $1, on account of what folks said had happened there, and what folks said still walked those empty rooms at night. Nell did not laugh. She sat very still at Constance Reyes's kitchen table for a long moment, and then she asked, in a voice that came out steadier than she expected, exactly which $2 a person would need. She rode into Widow's Bend on a cold morning in April. 5 years and 1 season since she had walked out of it, and the town had barely changed at all. The same crooked bell over the mercantile, the same lean to the church roof, the same faces on the boardwalk who turned to watch her pass with the particular stillness of people recognizing a ghost. She tied her horse outside the courthouse and walked in with her $4 folded to 2. And the clerk, a narrow, careful man named Mr. Dunmore, who had known her father, looked at her for a long moment before he found his voice enough to ask her business. When she told him she had come for the Calloway auction, he set down his pen the way a man sets down something he is afraid to drop, and told her plainly that the ranch had been abandoned 3 years, that Wendell Calloway had let the herd scatter and the buildings rot rather than do the work of running it honestly, that the county had all but given up finding a bidder willing to take on land that carried, in the town's whispered opinion, more grief than grass. Nell laid her $2 on the counter and told him that would be more than sufficient, and Mr. Dunmore After a silence that seemed to weigh the whole history of the Bishop and Calloway families at once, took up his pen and began to write. Outside on the boardwalk, Wendell Calloway himself was waiting, a soft, restless man in his 30s who had inherited his father's coldness without any of his father's discipline. And when Nell stepped out with the deed folded against her coat, he laughed the loud laugh of a man who wanted the whole street to hear his contempt, and told her she had bought herself a graveyard with a barn on it, that the land would take her $2 back within the month and her sanity along with it, and that she would come crawling to him inside a season, begging to sell it back for whatever pity he cared to offer. Nell did not answer him. She swung up into her saddle, turned her horse north toward the range road, and rode out of town the same way she had walked out of it 5 years before, carrying more now than she had carried then, though not yet knowing how much more. The ranch house, when she reached it at dusk, stood exactly as ruin had left it, a long low structure sagging at one corner where the foundation stones had shifted, windows broken or boarded, a porch that groaned under her boots but held, a barn beyond it leaning worse than the church in town, and over everything the particular silence of a place that had been waiting a long time for someone to come back and disturb it. She did not go inside that first night. She slept on the porch with her bedroll and her saddle for a pillow, listening to the old house settle and tick around her the way old wood does when the day's heat leaves it. And in the deep hours before dawn she heard, or thought she heard, a slow, patient creak from somewhere beneath the floor, as though the house itself were shifting to make room. She woke at first light and spent that first week the way she had learned to spend every hard thing in her life since her father's death, one task at a time, refusing to let the size of the ruin around her become an excuse to do nothing. She mended fence rail by rail, cleared the well of years of silt until the water ran clear, patched the roof with cedar shakes split from a fallen tree at the pasture's edge, and each small repair seemed to steady something in her chest as much as it steadied the buildings themselves. It was on the 9th day, working loose a section of warped flooring near the old stone hearth to lay it flat again, that her hand caught on a board that gave beneath her palm with more give than sound wood should allow, and she knelt and worked it up with the flat of a hatchet, and found beneath it, in the crawl space between floor and earth, a tin document box wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff as bark, exactly the kind of box a careful man might use to keep papers safe from fire and damp both. She sat back on her heels, a long moment before she opened it, some old instinct telling her that whatever waited inside had been waiting specifically, patiently for a bishop to come and find it. When she finally lifted the lid, the first thing inside was a folded document, so old the creases had gone soft as cloth. And when she opened it under the fading light from the broken window, she found herself looking at a partnership deed dated 1870, the original agreement between Thomas Bishop and Cyrus Calloway. Equal shares, equal say, witnessed and notarized, and entirely, unmistakably legitimate, a document that should have made her father's family co-owners of everything Cyrus Calloway built afterward. A document that, so far as the county records in town had ever shown, did not exist. Asterisk. Beneath the deed lay a second item that stopped her breath, entirely, a leather-bound ledger she recognized instantly by its binding as a twin to the one her father had kept. Except this one was in Cyrus Calloway's own hand, and the entries within it, once she forced herself to read past the trembling in her fingers, amounted to a private accounting of a fraud so patient and so thorough that it took her the better part of an hour, by lantern light, to understand its full shape. Cyrus Calloway, it seemed, had spent the winter of 1876 quietly buying the silence of a territorial brand inspector and paying a drifter named Prout, no relation, she would later confirm, to her uncle Silas, though the near echo of the name unsettled her all the same, to alter hides and plant a halter bearing Thomas Bishop's initials near a gully on the North Range. manufacturing evidence of a rustling that had never occurred. In order to have his partner removed and the whole of the range absorbed under a single name before expansion debts came due. The ledger recorded the payments in Cyrus's own careful hand, dated and initialed. The same habit of record-keeping that had once been Thomas Bishop's virtue turned, in his partner's hands, into a private confession he had apparently never intended anyone to read. Beneath the ledger, wrapped in a second square of oilcloth, lay a letter in a shakier, later hand, dated only months before Cyrus Calloway's death, addressed to no one in particular, to whoever might someday find it. In it, an old man who had built an empire on another man's ruin wrote, in halting sentences that read like a confession dragged out of him by illness or fear, or something that had finally caught up to his conscience, that he had wronged Thomas Bishop beyond any repair he knew how to make while he lived, that he had told himself for 20 years the empire was his by right of labor and daring, and that he had come in his final winter to understand it was never his alone at all. He wrote that if the truth were ever found, half of everything built on that range rightfully belonged to the Bishop family, and that whatever remained of his own fortune ought to go first toward repaying the smaller ranchers and townsfolk he had squeezed and underpaid across 2 decades of expansion. Men and women whose names filled the ledger's later pages and columns of debts he had never intended to honor. It was, Nell understood as she sat with the letter trembling in her hands, as close to an apology as Cyrus Calloway had ever been capable of giving, offered far too late to the daughter of the man he had destroyed, and offered to a town he had quietly cheated for 20 years without most of it ever knowing the cheating had a name. She did not go running to the courthouse with the tin box the next morning. Something in her, older than her 23 years, told her the discovery deserved more care than haste, and told her, too, that a town which had once believed the worst of her family on the strength of a planted halter would need more than her word alone to believe the best of it now. She wrapped the box back in its oilcloth, hid it beneath a loose hearthstone she mortared over with mud from the yard, and returned to the slow, visible work of rebuilding because she understood, without needing to say it aloud, that the truth would land far heavier on a town's ear if it arrived standing on ground that had already begun to heal. Word of her return traveled faster than she moved, as word always does in small places, and it was not many days before Wendell Calloway rode out to see for himself what had become of the woman he expected to be starved off the range by now. He found instead mended fence and a cleared well, and a woman who met his eyes without flinching, and something in his easy contempt curdled into something uglier. He offered first to buy the ranch back from her at 5 times what she had paid, calling it a kindness, and when she declined, his kindness soured fast. Cattle from his remaining herd began to appear on her cleared pasture, as though by accident, trampling her new fence lines. A rumor moved through town, traceable to no one in particular, that the Bishop girl had come back to dig up old bones best left buried, and ought to be run off before she stirred up grief the county had settled long ago. One night not 2 weeks after her discovery, someone fired her newly repaired barn roof at the corner nearest the road. A fire she caught early enough to smother with wet sacking before it took hold, though the scorch mark remained afterward like a warning nailed into the wood. She did not run. She rode instead to the county seat, and found the old circuit lawyer who had witnessed her father's original partnership agreement decades before, a stooped, careful man named Elias Thorne, now nearing retirement, and laid the tin box's contents before him on his own desk. Thorne read the partnership deed and the ledger and the letter in near silence, turning pages slowly, and when he finally looked up at her, his voice carried the particular gravity of a man who has just watched an old injustice come apart in his own hands. He told her the deed alone would very likely restore her family's rightful half of the Calloway holdings through the courts, but that the ledger and the confession letter together were something larger than a property dispute. They were a record that, could unwind 20 years of underpayment and quiet fraud against half the ranching families in the county. Families who had sold cattle to Calloway at prices his own hand admitted were rigged low. Families still owed money none of them knew to ask for. In the weeks between the barn fire and the hearing, Nell found herself watched in a way she had not been watched since she was a child riding in front of her father's saddle. Though the watching now came in two very different currents. Some of it was cold and testing, men who rode past her fence line slower than they needed to. Women in the mercantile who fell silent when she came through the door and resumed their talk only once the bell over it had stilled behind her. But some of the watching, to her quiet surprise, had begun to warm. A rancher named Otis Fell, whose family had sold stock to Calloway for 15 years at prices he had never fully trusted, rode out one morning with a wagon of split fence rail he said he had no use for and would not take payment for, and stayed the better part of a day helping her set new posts along the road frontage without once being asked. Agatha Voss walked the 4 miles from town twice that summer. First to bring a jar of honey and sit with Nell on the mended porch saying little, and a second time simply to look once at the new brand mark taking shape at the forge and to tell her, in the plain voice of a woman who had delivered half the county into the world, that her mother would have known exactly what to do with a summer like this one. It was Agatha, too, who first spoke the truth of the old rustling charge aloud in public, months before the courtroom made it official, standing at a church supper to say plainly that she had never once believed Thomas Bishop capable of stealing from his own herd, and that she had held her tongue for 20 years out of fear rather than conviction, a fear she was too old now to keep feeding. It was a small thing, said over a supper table rather than a courtroom bench, but it moved through Widow's Bend faster than any lawyer's filing, and by the time the county finally set a date to hear the matter formally, a good portion of the town had already begun quietly rehearsing in kitchens and barns and church pews the shape of a story they had spent 2 decades telling themselves the wrong way. The matter came before the county court that summer in a hearing the whole of Widow's Bend turned out to watch, packed onto benches and standing along the walls, because by then the story had traveled well beyond rumor into something the town could no longer look away from. Wendell Calloway, called to answer for his father's ledger, tried first to claim the documents were forgeries, then that even if genuine they changed nothing since his father alone had held the deed of record for 2 decades. And Judge Harmon Cole, an old dry man not given to sentiment, listened to the argument with visible impatience before observing that a signed and witnessed partnership deed, however long suppressed, did not expire simply because its suppression had been successful, and that a man's own confession, written in his own hand and found sealed beneath his own former roof, was not easily waved away as inconvenient. The old woman Agatha Voss, who had served as midwife to half the county and had attended Ruth Bishop in her final illness, rose unbidden from the gallery to say she had always known there was more to the Bishop ruin than the town had let itself believe, and that she for one was glad to have lived long enough to see it said aloud in daylight. Others followed her, quietly at first, and then less quietly. Ranchers who recalled being paid $1 a head less than the going rate for years running, and never understanding why. And by the time the hearing adjourned, the shape of the truth stood plain enough that even those slowest to admit it could no longer pretend otherwise. Asterisk. Nell did not use her restored inheritance to build herself the kind of empire her father's partner once dreamed of. She used it instead the way her mother had once told her, braiding her hair by lamplight. That kindness paid forward multiplied itself in places a person would never live to see. She repaid every family named in the ledger promptly and in full, refused to charge a single ranching neighbor a rate she would not have wanted charged to herself, and rebuilt the old Calloway Bishop Range not as one woman's private holding but as a cooperative grazing arrangement among the small ranchers who had been squeezed thin for 20 years. sharing water rights and winter feed and the labor of roundup in a way the old empire, built on one man's hunger, had never allowed. The ranch house she rebuilt board by board, and above its mantel, where her father's initials had once stood beside a mark that was never rightfully Calloway's alone. She had a new brand cut fresh at the town forge, joining the two family names as they should have stood joined from the beginning. A mark meant to outlast every rumor the town had ever whispered about a Bishop girl thrown into the road. Her uncle Silas Pruitt came to her that winter, older and thinner than she remembered, his dry goods store failing under debts of his own poor judgment. And he stood at her gate with his hat in both hands and told her, in a voice stripped of all its old certainty, that he supposed he owed her an apology he did not know how to properly give. Nell did not make him beg for it, and did not, either, pretend the years above his storeroom had cost her nothing. She told him only that she forgave him because she had learned, watching what 20 years of unrepaid debt could do to a man's soul, that grudges kept as carefully as ledgers eventually cost more to hold than to release, and that she intended to spend the rest of her life proving her father's old belief correct, that a mind and a heart both, trained toward fairness, were never wasted. Whatever the world first assumed about the person carrying them at 18, Nell Bishop had been told she was worth nothing. Cast into an October road with $4 and a Bible and no one in the world obliged to catch her. At 23, she rode back into the same town with 2 of those dollars still folded soft against her chest, and bought, for the price of a meal, 1,200 acres that the whole county had agreed to call a graveyard. What she found sealed beneath its floorboards was not treasure in the ordinary sense, though it changed her fortune as surely as any strongbox of gold might have. It was the truth her father had died still insisting on, patient and undestroyed, waiting 5 years in the dark for a bishop to come home and open it. She had not gone looking for vengeance, and had not built her restored inheritance into a monument to her own vindication. She had used it instead exactly as her mother once told her kindness ought to be used, paid forward into a town that had once turned its back on her, multiplying itself in fields she would spend the rest of her days tending. It was never a graveyard at all, she told the old ledger keeper Elias Thorne once, near the end of that first autumn, when he asked what she meant to call the place now that the deed stood clean in her name alone. It was a debt, she said, that had simply been waiting long enough to be paid. Thank you for staying with Nell's story all the way to its quiet end. If a tale of overlooked worth and patient truth finding its way home is the kind of story that stays with you, we would love to know in the comments below about a time in your own life when you found real value in something the world around you had already written off: an old house, an old friendship, an old piece of yourself nobody else believed was worth saving. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that being cast out is never the same as being finished. And if you would like more evenings spent in towns like Widow's Bend, consider staying close to this channel for the next one. Until next time, stay close, *.